NATO.
For letters that are dominating every evening news broadcast, from the rushed headlines crawling across TV screens to the heated arguments on social media about the war in Ukraine. For people in Kiev, it is spoken of like a savior that could stop the advance of Russian tanks. But for those sitting in the Kremlin, it is a threat pressed up against their throat. We hear about NATO every day. NATO holds emergency meetings, NATO supplies weapons, NATO expands. But let's be honest with each other. What do you actually understand about this organization beyond its name? Is NATO simply a club of the United States and its European friends? Why does an alliance born out of fear in 1949 still exist and expand so powerfully when its original enemy, the Soviet Union, collapsed more than 30 years ago? What is happening inside the meeting rooms in Brussels, where 32 countries that hold much of the world's nuclear power make decisions together? And why is NATO, an organization once described as brain-dead, shifting into a wartime posture in 2025? Most of us only see the tip of the iceberg, diplomatic handshakes and forceful statements. This is not dry historical information, but a comprehensive analysis of the giant shaping the fate of the world we live in. Part 1. Born from Fear, 1948 to 1949. Rewind to the spring of 1948, 1 year before NATO was created. Europe at that time was not the romantic travel paradise we know today, but a region barely clinging to life, exhausted by the unbearable cost of 6 years of war. Even though the British carried the label of victors, they still lived on ration coupons, with bread rations even smaller than during the war. The reason was that the finances of the British Empire had been completely drained by massive wartime spending. As soon as the guns fell silent, the flow of emergency aid from the United States was abruptly cut off, pushing Britain into a near-bankruptcy state, without foreign currency to import food. And in Berlin, the capital of the defeated, mothers had to dig through rubble to find even a few pieces of coal to keep their children warm in bone-piercing sub-zero cold. This was the residue of thousands of tons of bombs dropped by Allied forces, flattening 70% of a city. Infrastructure, electricity, water, and supply chains had been completely crushed, forcing people who once lived in a great industrial power back toward a Stone Age existence, fighting for survival among piles of bricks. But the cold weather was not as frightening as the chill running down the spines of Western leaders. Fear of Joseph Stalin. While US and British forces were demobilizing in huge numbers so soldiers could go home, on the other side, the Soviet Red Army still maintained millions of troops in a combat-ready posture. Powerful T-34 tank divisions were poised in East Germany, only a few days' march from Western European capitals. Western naivety officially shattered in May 1948. In Czechoslovakia, the last remaining democracy in Eastern Europe, a lightning coup took place. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, the son of Czechoslovakia's independence, was found dead in the courtyard of the Foreign Ministry building, still in his pajamas. The official conclusion was suicide, but across the West people whispered that he had been thrown out of a window. The event hit British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin like a bucket of ice water to the face. He realized no one was safe. Today it was Prague. Tomorrow it could be Paris or Brussels. Fear grew even more severe in June 1948 when Stalin decided to strangle West Berlin, a free enclave sitting deep inside the Soviet zone of control. Every road, rail line, and waterway was cut. 2.5 million Berliners faced the threat of starvation. It was in the darkest hours of the Berlin blockade that the idea of a transatlantic military alliance was conceived. The West chose to respond by establishing the Berlin airlift for 324 days and nights. The roar of sea, 47 Dakotas flying US and British flags became the only heartbeat keeping Berlin alive. Every 30 seconds, another plane landed. That very sound of aircraft engines ultimately brought an end to American isolationism. On April 4, 1949, 12 countries gathered in Washington, D.C. U.S. President Harry Truman, a small man with round glasses, but carrying a world-changing decision, stepped up to the podium. In a moment, accidental or deliberate, the Marine Corps band played "I've Got Plenty o' Nuttin'," roughly, "I've Got Nothing at All," from the opera Porgy and Bess. The song perfectly reflected Europe's miserable military reality at the time. They had nothing but ruins. But when U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson signed the North Atlantic Treaty, he knew he had created something. A treaty with a special Article 5, which we will discuss later. For the first time in U.S. history, the giant that had always avoided the troubles of the old continent committed to binding its fate to Europe. The paper signed that day was thin and fragile, but its weight was heavy enough to stop the advance of Soviet tanks without firing a single shot. NATO was born like that, not in fireworks celebrating victory, but out of Jan Masaryk's death, the roar of transport aircraft over the skies of Berlin, and the handshakes of nations living in fear. Part 2. NATO in detail, legal framework and the power apparatus. Before we talk about the rumbling Leopard tank convoys or advanced Patriot missile systems, we need to understand NATO's skeleton. This organization is not simply a collection of armies standing side by side on a battlefield. It is a complex political, military entity run on the basis of an exceptionally binding commitment called the North Atlantic Treaty. This text is astonishingly short, only 14 articles, and can be read in a mere 10 minutes. Yet it has built the security order of the Western world for more than 7 decades. To understand how this giant machine operates, we must first eliminate a common misconception, that NATO is run by generals. The reality is the complete opposite. The supreme Western principle is civilian control of the military. Therefore, NATO has a dual-headed power structure, separate, but tightly connected. The first head, holding the highest authority, is the North Atlantic Council, NAC. This is where ambassadors representing each member state gather, people in suits, not uniforms. Chaired by the Secretary General, the alliance's diplomatic face, they meet weekly in Brussels to make political decisions. Not a single bullet is fired, and not a single aircraft is permitted to take off without unanimous approval from these diplomats. The second head serves as the muscle executing orders, the military committee and the Allied command operations shape. Here, chiefs of defense translate political will into operational plans. There is an unwritten but unbreakable rule in this structure. The head of Allied command operations, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, has always been a U.S. general or admiral. This arrangement is a strategic umbilical cord, ensuring NATO's power is always anchored to the United States' vast war machine. Breathing life into this apparatus are 3 legal pillars that function like the alliance's operating system. First is the principle of self-reliance, set out in Article 3. Before expecting allies to come to the rescue, each country must save itself by continuously maintaining and developing its own defensive capacity. This is the legal basis that prevents members from becoming freeloaders under America's security umbrella. They must contribute real financial and military resources, leading to fierce disputes over spending targets like 2% or 5% of GDP. When a member state feels its security is being shaken but has not yet suffered a direct attack, it turns to Article 4, the alarm bell. This clause allows any member to call an emergency consultation when it feels its territorial integrity or security is threatened. Looking back at history, many of the world's major moments of tension have begun here, from Turkey's fear of Iraqi missiles in 2003 to Poland's alarm when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and peaking with the red alarm in September 2025 after an incident in which Russian trolls violated Poland's space, pushing the alliance into a pre-war posture. Finally, in the most sacred position in the treaty lies Article 5, likened to the alliance's Bible, or a blood oath. Its content carries absolute deterrent force. An armed attack against one member would be considered an attack against all. This is a form of psychological warfare that protects small countries like Luxembourg or Estonia, because any predator knows that touching them would mean declaring war on Washington, London, and Paris. However, the language of Article 5 was drafted with extreme cleverness to slip through the narrow gap of the U.S. Constitution. It does not automatically trigger war. It only commits that each country will act as it deems necessary. Over more than 75 years of existence, Article 5 has been invoked only once, not to defend Europe, but to defend the United States after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Your transcript says May 11, 2001, which appears to be a slip. All of these complex mechanisms are run by a unique decision-making principle: absolute consensus. In NATO, there is no concept of majority voting or the minority obeys the majority. Every decision passes only when no one objects. This gives every country, even the smallest, a de facto veto. That is the alliance's double-edged sword. It is both a shield for national sovereignty, helping the bloc maintain voluntary unity, and also a lethal Achilles heel. History has repeatedly seen this powerful military machine temporarily paralyzed by a single shake of the head from Turkey or Hungary, turning collective strength meaningless in crises that require lightning-fast reaction speed. Part 3. Expansion, Cracks, and Ghosts, 1949 to 1990. After the solemn signing ceremony in Washington, NATO was, in reality, still just a giant on paper. The 12 founding countries were a rather messy collection bound together more by fear than by real power. It was a combination of the two North American powers, the United States and Canada, a linkage of exhausted old empires, Britain and France, a connection of the small Benelux states, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, and finally the strategic gatekeepers, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Portugal, and Italy. At that time, if the Soviet Red Army had chosen to attack, it might have taken only a few days to reach the Atlantic coast. Recognizing this weakness, NATO began, over the next decade, a campaign to reinforce the fortress through a series of bold geopolitical moves. But that very expansion also brought unexpected consequences. Tightening the encirclement, 1952 to 1955. In 1952, NATO carried out its first calculated expansion by admitting Greece and Turkey. Look at a map and their positions. Turkey controls the Bosporus Strait, the only route through which the Soviet Union's powerful Black Sea Fleet could reach the Mediterranean. Bringing Ankara into NATO meant slamming the southern door shut right in front of Moscow's nose, turning the Soviet Union into a captive within its own sea. But the punch that truly struck Russian psychology came in 1955. The accession of West Germany. For Soviet citizens who had just emerged from World War II with 27 million dead, the image of German forces, those who had once devastated their homeland, being rearmed, wearing new uniforms under the NATO flag, was an unacceptable nightmare. That event was the final straw. Only days after West Germany joined NATO, Moscow responded by creating the Warsaw Pact, formally splitting Europe into two blocs facing each other directly. From then on, the Cold War was no longer just threats. It became two loaded barrels aimed at one another. A crack inside the fortress, France's break in 1966. As the outer wall grew stronger thanks to American military power, the internal foundation began to shake with national pride. The stronger NATO became, the more overwhelming US dominance appeared, and this became a thorn in the eye of French President Charles de Gaulle. For de Gaulle, a great France could not be a vassal taking orders from Washington. He wanted NATO to be an alliance of equal partners, even proposing a tripartite leadership mechanism with the US, the UK, and France. Naturally, the United States ignored the idea. The pressure exploded in 1966 when de Gaulle issued a shocking ultimatum. France would remain an ally, but French forces would no longer be under NATO commanders, and US bases would have to leave French territory. The result was that NATO's headquarters and thousands of military personnel had to pack up and leave Paris, relocating to Belgium. This event became a major scar. Although France remained in the alliance politically for the next 43 years, until 2009, France's empty seat in the military structure stood as a reminder of the West's fragile unity. The Ghosts, Operation Gladio. If France's withdrawal from the integrated command was an open wound, visible and relatively easy to plan around, then Operation Gladio was a malignant growth developing quietly in the shadows, raising questions about the balance between morality and security. Driven by the obsession that the Soviet Red Army might flood into Western Europe at any time, the CIA and NATO intelligence secretly built a network known as Stay Behind. They recruited hardline anti-communists, even some former fascists, and buried thousands of weapons caches, explosives, and gold in forests and caves from Italy and Belgium to Norway. The script was already written. If the Soviet Union invaded, these ghosts would rise from underground to wage guerrilla war. Tragically, the Soviet invasion never came. But Gladio's guns still fired, and the barrels turned back toward their own people. In Italy, during the bloody period known as the Years of Lead, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, members of this network were accused of colluding with far-right groups and the mafia to carry out horrific bombings at train stations and public squares. The goal of this strategy of tension was to spread fear among the public, blame the Italian Communist Party, and prevent it from winning elections. When Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti was forced to acknowledge Gladio's existence before Parliament in 1990, the Western world was stunned. The monument of an alliance meant to defend freedom and democracy suddenly looked stained. People realized that in its survival struggle with the Soviet Union, NATO was willing to cultivate monsters inside its own house, and the price was the blood of innocent civilians it had sworn to protect. Part 4. Searching for a new enemy and expansion to the east, 1991 to 2013. On Christmas night in 1991, the hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the last time atop the Kremlin. The Soviet Union collapsed. For many, it was good news, but for NATO, it was a crisis. What does a military alliance created to oppose the USSR do when the USSR no longer exists? Many analysts at the time predicted NATO would dissolve. But instead of doing so, NATO chose to move forward by swallowing the power vacuums left behind by the Soviet collapse. The focal point of this period is the historical dispute over the not 1 inch promise. Russia has long insisted that during the negotiations on German reunification in 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker promised Soviet leader Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, even though no legally binding document was signed. NATO's subsequent admissions of former Warsaw Pact members made Moscow feel deceived and encircled. The 1999 enlargement brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, countries that had once served as Russia's security buffer, turning them into NATO's forward outposts. But the real strategic punch was the Big Bang, enlargement of 2004, when the alliance took in the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Look at their location. Estonia is only about 150 kilometers from Putin's hometown, St. Petersburg. For the first time in history, NATO tanks and radar could look straight toward Russia's bedroom. For Russia's elite, this was not only a military threat, but a national humiliation, sowing the seeds of a revenge psychology that later fed into the war in Ukraine. Alongside expansion, NATO desperately searched for a new mission to prove it was still useful, and it found one in the Balkans. In 1999, to stop ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, NATO launched an air campaign lasting 78 days. This was the first time NATO attacked a sovereign state without UN authorization, creating a dangerous precedent. But the moment etched into history came on the night of Day 0, Month 0, 1999. The transcript's date is garbled. 5 JDAM smart bombs from USB, 2 stealth bombers tore through the night over Belgrade and struck the Chinese embassy. 3 journalists were killed. The building caught fire. Although the United States explained that it was an accident caused by outdated maps, the Chinese never believed it. For Beijing, it was the moment they realized NATO was not merely a European matter, but an aggressive war machine capable of threatening anyone, pushing China to modernize its military at breakneck speed. Then came September 11th, 2001. Your transcript says May 11th, 2001, and the war in Afghanistan. NATO activated Article 5 for the first time to defend the United States, sending forces into a land often called the graveyard of empires. For 20 years, the strongest alliance in history tried to turn Afghanistan into a Western-style democracy. But trillions of dollars and countless lives were poured away when the Taliban regained control within weeks after the U.S. withdrawal in 2021. That failure exposed a bitter truth. NATO may be a devastating machine on the battlefield, but it is a poor engineer when it comes to building peace. Part 5. Strategic Reconfiguration and the New Security Era, 2014 to 2025. If you view NATO's historical trajectory like a sinusoidal chart, the early 2010s correspond to a deep trough in strategic direction. This was the era when the peace dividend dominated policymakers' thinking on the old continent. With the belief that large-scale conventional war had permanently receded into the past, European governments from Berlin to Paris carried out a massive resource shift, cutting defense budgets to pour money into social welfare systems and economic stimulus. The result was alarming degradation across many NATO militaries. A striking example was Germany, Europe's largest economy. Shortages of equipment became so severe that during a 2014 exercise, soldiers in an armored unit reportedly painted broom handles black to imitate machine gun barrels because the armory was empty. Similarly, readiness reports for the German Air Force at the time indicated that only a small fraction of Eurofighter Typhoons were actually able to take off. Europe had, in effect, disarmed itself and left security to the protection umbrella of the United States. This imbalance created deep fissures in transatlantic relations, fissures that had been smoldering under the Obama administration but truly erupted into a diplomatic crisis under President Donald Trump. Washington no longer accepted the role of unilateral security patron. At NATO summits, President Trump broke with traditional diplomatic language and adopted a bluntly transactional approach. He publicly criticized allies as debtors and continuously pressured them to meet the minimum defense spending target of 2% of GDP, a pledge made at the Wales summit in 2014 but ignored by many countries. Tensions escalated to unprecedented levels when the occupant of the White House hinted that the United States might not honor Article 5 to defend members who refused to pay their bills. For Europe, this was not only financial pressure, but a psychological shock that shook the core belief that U.S. protection was unconditional. The peak of this identity crisis came in 2019 not only because of money but also because of strategic coordination breakdown. French President Emmanuel Macron sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles by using the term brain dead to describe the alliance's condition. This bitter assessment arose from a specific context. The United States unilaterally decided to withdraw forces from northern Syria without consulting European allies, creating conditions for Turkey, another NATO member, to launch a military operation against Kurdish forces that had fought alongside the West in the anti-terrorism campaign. This chaotic episode, where one NATO member threatened the interests of other members while the big brother, America, turned away and left, exposed a harsh reality. NATO at that moment looked like a gigantic body that had lost unified direction from its central nervous system. At that time, the most powerful military alliance in history seemed like a faded legacy of the past, struggling to find a reason to exist in the 21st century. However, Europe's security environment changed completely due to shocks from the East. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was the first alarm bell, but only when the special military operation in Ukraine began in February 2022. Your transcript says May 2022. Did NATO's security structure truly wake up? The conflict immediately stitched together internal divisions and reasserted the alliance's core role: collective defense. The clearest political consequence of the conflict lay not only in military aid packages, but in a shift by historically neutral states. Finland and Sweden's successive moves into NATO during 2023 to 2024 marked a historic turning point, ending centuries-long non-alignment policies for these two Nordic countries. The accession of these two new members fundamentally changed the military balance in the region. The direct NATO-Russia border has doubled, forcing Moscow to disperse its defensive forces. More importantly, the Baltic Sea, an essential maritime artery and a crucial gateway for Russia's trade, has, in effect, come under tight monitoring by NATO member states. This creates a strategic encirclement posture against Russia's Baltic fleet while strengthening the ability to defend NATO members in Eastern Europe. The paradox of history is that Russia's effort to push back Western influence has produced the opposite result. NATO's presence has become denser and pressed closer to Russia's borders than ever before. Moving into 2025, Europe's political chessboard witnessed a shift with the transfer of power in Berlin. The emergence of the new chancellor, Fred Richam, who officially took office in May 2025, ended the long era of strategic caution under his predecessor Olaf Sh. Unlike the earlier hesitant style, Mr. Mies, described as a conservative, pragmatic politician, brought a more decisive vision to the European Council. Germany cannot remain merely an economic power while being a military dwarf. Mr. Mies argued that to protect Europe's prosperity, Berlin must fully discard historical inhibitions and become the continent's central military pillar, ready to confront challenges from the east directly. This hardened wind from Berlin set the stage for a historically tense atmosphere at the NATO summit in The Hague in June 2025. There, under strong momentum from EU to S. Germany, Poland alignment, NATO members reached a commitment that shocked global observers, a roadmap to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP before 2035. This figure is a declaration of a societal model shift. To put it in perspective, throughout the Cold War, average spending typically hovered around the 3 to 4% range. Setting a 5% target means NATO is openly acknowledging that Europe is entering a wartime economy. However, this consensus did not come easily. It was forged through fierce, behind-the-scenes debates. Member states' reactions split sharply into two poles. On the eastern flank, countries such as Poland and the 3 Baltic states, already voluntarily spending above 4% because they feel the direct heat of the border conflict, strongly supported the move, seeing it as a necessary late awakening by the West. By contrast, in Western and Southern Europe, the proposal faced deep concern. High-debt economies such as Italy and Spain questioned its feasibility because allocating 1/20th of GDP to the military would force brutal cuts to healthcare, education, and pensions, a politically risky move that could trigger social instability. To reach final agreement, the concept of defense spending was broadened to include investments in cybersecurity, dual-use infrastructure such as railways and ports that can support military logistics, and high-technology research. Even so, implementing this commitment in practice would require a comprehensive economic restructuring not seen since the end of World War II. Civilian production lines are being converted to serve the defense industry, and long-term procurement contracts are being signed at record speed. In parallel, NATO is accelerating the realization of a new force model, turning paper commitments into tangible, hard power in the field. With 300,000 troops placed on a high-readiness posture, able to deploy to any hotspot within 30 days, a reaction speed that only a few years ago would have been unimaginable for this alliance's bureaucracy. The new security environment's level of tension was clearly demonstrated by an incident in September 2025, when a group of drones from the conflict in the east strayed off course and exploded inside Polish territory. Unlike the caution shown in similar incidents in the past, NATO's response this time carried a far higher deterrent posture. Through the activation of Operation Eastern Century, the alliance established an air defense buffer zone along the eastern border, with new rules of engagement permitting interception of airborne objects that pose a risk of violating NATO airspace. Although intended to protect territory, this move also significantly increases the risk of direct military confrontation because air defense systems remain on the highest state of alert. Not limited to the Atlantic sphere, NATO is also turning toward the Indo-Pacific. At first glance, NATO's presence in this region seems geographically paradoxical. Article 6 of the Washington Treaty limits the alliance's defense scope to North America and Europe. However, Brussels' strategic thinking has shifted completely based on a new reality. Global security can no longer be separated by oceans. The first and strongest driver comes from the hard lesson of Ukraine. This war showed NATO commanders that the European battlefield cannot be separated from Asian actors. When North Korean-produced artillery shells appear on the Donbass front, or Chinese dual-use components are found in the wreckage of Russian drones. NATO realized it cannot protect its eastern flank if it ignores the giant standing behind the war machine supporting Russia. The no-limits partnership between Beijing and Moscow has blurred the boundary between the European and Asian fronts, forcing NATO to seek partners on the other side of the globe to build a balancing pincer posture. The second reason is economic, existential even. In the 20th century, the West's lifeline ran through the Atlantic. But in the 21st century, the heart of the global economy beats in the Indo-Pacific, which holds 60% of world GDP and the planet's most critical sea lanes. NATO understands that a conflict in the Taiwan Strait or a blockade in the South China Sea would not be Asia's problem. It would immediately destabilize European economies dependent on supply chains for semiconductors and high technology. Therefore, cooperation with the IP4 group, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand is not about sending NATO armies to conquer Asia, but about ensuring freedom of navigation. The lung that sustains Western prosperity cannot be strangled by any great power. Finally, there is the technology race shaping the future. Modern war is no longer decided only by the number of tanks, but by AI, semiconductors, cybersecurity, and space technologies. In these domains, Japan and South Korea are leading powers with capabilities NATO urgently wants. Through the IP4 mechanism, NATO is not merely seeking military partners. It is building a technology coalition to ensure democratic states stay one step ahead of competitors in the contest to control the technological standards of the new century. Therefore, NATO's expansion into Asia is essentially an effort to patch security gaps that traditional geography no longer covers in a flat, volatile world. Part 6. NATO's new position and strategic challenges. Over more than 75 years of formation and development, NATO has transformed from a regionally bounded defensive posture in the North Atlantic into a political, military entity with global influence. This process did not follow a straight line. It passed through multiple phases of strategic adjustment, from building defensive capability during the Cold War, to searching for a new role after the Soviet collapse, to reshaping its security focus amid political shocks from 2014 to 2025. However, NATO's growth in size and operational scope also raises complex issues for the international order. The greatest challenge of the coming decade lies in solving the security dilemma: how to maintain deterrence and protect member states without pushing rivals into extremist reactions that increase the risk of direct conflict. The future of the global security architecture will depend heavily on NATO's ability to control risk and on its strategic playbooks for balancing defense objectives with the stability of international relations. We hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support us.